Abraham Lincoln was possibly America's greatest president. After being assassinated at Ford's Theater on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln became one of the first celebrities in American history to be embalmed. You would think Lincoln's body would be treated with respect after that fateful day. In a way, he was. But in another way, the treatment of Lincoln's body changed everything about funerals in the U.S. forever. Today, we're going to take a look at how Abraham Lincoln's assassination created the multi-billion-dollar American death industry. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other histories of industries you would like to hear about. Okay, now, thank you for coming, and if you would like to pay your respects, please watch this explainer video. Prior to the Civil War, Americans had relatively simple ways of dealing with the dead. They would wash them, dress them up in something nice, and light some candles around the body in the hopes of hiding the stench. After that, friends, relatives, and jaded ex-lovers might stop over to say goodbye one last time. Then, once it was at the cemetery, the casket, which was usually a simple wooden box, would be lowered into the earth. People would say some nice things, and for the most part, that was it. A person's journey on this earth was over. No fuss, no muss. Now, let's go have some potato salad at the wake. Given that there were Americans on both sides of the conflict, the Civil War was by far the bloodiest confrontation the country had ever seen. That meant there was suddenly a huge number of the unliving laying about. Of course, the lifeless decompose quickly, so most soldiers were just abandoned on the battlefields to decompose. That was acceptable for many folks, but not everyone wanted to return to the earth in whatever random spot they fell. Embalming was invented in Europe in the 1830s, and by the time the Civil War kicked off, it had made its way to America. Some of these newly minted embalmers would approach soldiers who were about to go into battle and offer their services, if they might need them. While you have to respect the hustle, you probably won't be too surprised to hear that the military considered this bad for morale and ended the practice. But soldiers weren't the only people who could choose to be embalmed. Many families, especially rich northern ones, often paid to have their loved ones returned to them. In order to make the long journey without rotting, the fallen soldiers had to be embalmed. It is estimated that 40,000 out of the 600,000 fallen soldiers went through the embalming process. As the demand for embalming grew, more and more men, and given the time period, it was basically only men, got involved. However, as with nearly every profession, not every embalmer was on the up and up. Families were so desperate to get their loved ones back home to be buried that some embalmers started price gouging. The military offered generous bounties for the embalmed, $30 for a soldier and $80 for an officer, which translates to roughly $900 to $2,500 modern dollars. That being the case, it wasn't unusual to see embalmers literally fighting for fallen soldiers after the battles were done raging. And I thought Black Friday sales were bad. It eventually got so bad that the War Department had to issue General Order No. 39, which stated that anyone who wanted to interact with those soldiers had to have a special license. It also set the price for embalming services. Unfortunately, this wasn't decreed until March of 1865, when the war was almost over. So unscrupulous embalmers thrived for most of the conflict. But better late than never. President Lincoln would have been familiar with embalming by the time it was his turn to undergo the process. In fact, the very first casualty of the Civil War was actually embalmed. His name was Colonel Elmer Ephraim Ellsworth, and he was a friend of Lincoln's. He was taken out on May 24, 1861, shot after taking down a Confederate flag from the top of a hotel in Alexandria, Virginia. An embalmer named Dr. Holmes approached Lincoln and offered to do the embalming for free, probably just wanting to show off his new technique. The coffin was even made with a special window so you could see Ellsworth's face and chest. Thousands of people turned out to see the colonel in Washington and New York, and he actually wasn't buried for 10 days. The embalming process did its job, but it still wasn't foolproof. The New York Times even reported at the time that Ellsworth's face had a livid paleness. To be fair, that's how the New York Times describes every performance by the band Coldplay. While not perfect, Lincoln must have liked the idea of embalming, since when his 11-year-old son Willie passed away less than a year later, the Lincolns asked that Willie go through the same process. This let them keep their son in the White House longer and allowed them to grieve. Since embalming was such a new science, it was still fairly rudimentary, and not much like the far more complex procedures bodies go through today. Even when President Lincoln was put through the process, they didn't do that much to him. It was up to Dr. Charles Brown and Dr. Harry Cattell to make the president, who, don't forget, had just been shot in the back of the cranium, look decent. First, they flushed out his lifeblood. Then they pumped in a special embalming fluid invented by Brown. Interestingly, formaldehyde wasn't used for embalming yet. Lincoln was then dressed in a suit and made as presentable as possible. Cattell even traveled with the president's funeral procession, just in case he needed any touch-ups on the long road to his burial. Making sure Lincoln remained dignified was a top priority. Lincoln was so beloved by the American people that Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, decided people would certainly want to see him one last time and pay their respects. Prior to embalming, Lincoln would have succumbed to the elements only after a few days. But going through the process meant he could be taken through a huge swatch of the country on a tour that lasted for weeks. Lincoln was put on a train to kick off the farewell tour. It traveled over 1,600 miles, stopped in 7 states, and made appearances in 180 cities and towns. The idea was to recreate in reverse the trip Lincoln made to get from Illinois to Washington, D.C. when he was elected president. At every major city, Lincoln was actually removed from the train and laid in state in whatever important building was available. The ambitious plan put an enormous strain on the new embalming. Eventually, the strain became too much. Even with today's fancier techniques, anybody would be hard-pressed to make it through what Lincoln's was subjected to. Traveling thousands of miles is strenuous enough for the living, but Lincoln also went through many bumpy carriage journeys and was exposed to the elements for hours at a time. Keep in mind, there was also no refrigeration anywhere. Even with the attendant embalmer around to fix him up, Lincoln started to break down. By the time he made it to Manhattan, the president's face people saw was no longer a dignified Lincoln, but rather a ghastly shadow. Discoloration set in, and according to contemporary reports, he appeared wan and shrunken. Still, without the embalming, it would have been much, much worse. The New York Times said that as long as you hadn't actually known Lincoln when he was alive, then you would have been happy with how he looked. Even with the deterioration problems, Lincoln was still the most well-preserved person many people had ever seen. It was likely pretty mind-blowing for most folks to know that he had been gone for days but was still pretty well preserved. People put a lot of effort into getting a glimpse of the president. They waited in line for hours in all weather just to be able to see Lincoln and pay their final respects. Some even went around more than once, and many ex-slaves came to see the man. Although some might have been there out of a morbid curiosity, everyone seemed to take away at least one thing. When it came to the great beyond, embalming was the way of the future. The First Lady had already suffered a lot in life, having lost 2 of her sons when they were still children. After her husband's assassination, she was so grief-stricken she couldn't leave her bed. She didn't even sit up for 5 days. She was able to ask for her husband to be embalmed, but that was about it. Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, took over planning the funeral. He even overruled Mary Todd Lincoln when she asked that her husband be taken back to Illinois by the most direct route possible. So instead of personal mourning, the outpouring at Lincoln's death became public. While Mary thought her husband would have found this unseemly, historians still debate over what Lincoln himself actually would have thought. During his life, Lincoln believed in people having access to their politicians, so to many, it stands to reason that he would have felt the same in death. While the Civil War might have started the idea, once that conflict was over and embalming wasn't needed as much anymore, it could very well have disappeared. But Lincoln changed everything. With millions of people suddenly aware of embalming, the funeral industry underwent a revolution, and embalming only continued to grow in popularity. It became almost a trend at first. If embalming was good enough for the president, it was good enough for your family members. No more lying around for a day or two surrounded by candles to mask the smell. Now your loved ones could last longer, and bigger events could be held to commemorate them. Funerals became more ornate, and wakes even more popular. Viewing your loved one became something normal and almost nice, instead of grossly morbid. Embalming completely changed how people viewed death. In modern times, however, embalming might be on its way out. The chemicals used are harsh on the environment, and people are starting to look to greener ways to deal with the passing of a loved one. But it isn't gone yet, and the trend Lincoln started has been going strong for over a century and a half. Talk about being an influencer. So what do you think? How do you want your funeral to go? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.